Hello everyone, today we talk about the Galatian Celtic army organization. We already discussed Celtic warfare in many videos, including in fact the Gallic armies organization, Celtic armies in general. We looked at different battles, including the one of the Allia River. We will look at others also closer to our timeline here. The Galatians are an interesting people, as they are essentially the Asian Celts settled in the region that would take the name after it. It was essentially Phrygia. However, this is the Anatolian hinterland, where the Celtic tribes arrived after actually a failed attempt at the invasion of Greece. I made a video about the Skordiski that are exactly in part the product of this withdrawal from Hellas into the Balkans along the Danube. Incredibly fascinating people that had very advanced civilizational characteristics, even for saying Celtic standards, at least for being especially Danubian Celts. They were connected very far thanks to the same riverway up to northern Europe. The famous Ganderstrup cauldron seemingly may have originated from the same Skordiskian land. Eventually, these territories were taken over by the Romans. Galatia, I made a video about the province of, where we observed in part, in fact, the later history of the sort of independent and gradual, in fact, not so independent Galatian kingdom, so to say, even though it was actually a confederacy of different tribes emerging from the early 3rd century BC migration. When we talk about Celtic warfare, as you may remember as an old date follower, we tend to stress the sort of the actual homogeneity of their warfare, right? There is this notion here and there, especially in wargamistic circles, that given that ancient sources often provide us with specific information about this people or the other, and that of course this is a quite precious one considering the times and places, especially for these peoples that at the end of the day we know of in some depth of their culture, their politics, etc., because of Greco-Roman ethnography. We should sort of overly characterize this tribe or another on the basis of such information, right? And when we talk about military history, in particular the art of war, how these peoples fought in the fundamentals, we have appreciated, in fact, an overall sort of average quality that matches the broader continental European one. Every time I make these videos about the Celts, I try to be as straightforward as I can regarding the generalizations that would, like, especially if you open any of the older forums, etc., there's this notion, what if the Celts had united, and take a look, that are completely delirious in terms of historical reality, meaning we're looking, like, we're even very well informed about these populations, considering, again, the times and spaces, right? So aside from paranoid conspiracy theories that the Romans cancelled everything, or they had to represent these guys as, weaklings or whatever, we do know pretty concretely well what the kind of military quality of the broader Celtic world really was. And again, it was average, which means it wasn't terrific. Like, there were elite units that of course were pretty good. There was a lot of mercenarism around, but when we look at the broader consistency of the political cohesion, the social strength of these groups, we know how they ended, right? Either from the Roman or the Germanic side, the Celtic world had its own early, say, phase of expansion, was really impressive, and that produced really, mostly due to very intense moral strength, a great deal of results, including the ones of 280 BC that, albeit failing in the end, still represent, again, this primitive brutality of these peoples capable of taking on and defeating also some of the civilized world armies. The same goes in the wars with Rome, etc. But at large, we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that there was much of a broader military quality that you can simply sort of extremize and trying to apply as some sort of broader standard that doesn't explain why these people, at the end of the day, remained fundamentally backwards. From one side, what do you have to say? That they were strong, but they used it for good. They didn't make war, or they they could have used it, but they didn't. So what were they, stupid? Why don't we actually simply realize what they were, and being like adult people about it? This is always a huge problem. There's always someone complaining about this. For the unfortunate reason that most people do not actually look at history, even less at military history. They just want to pick superheroes, eliminating any assessment, any level of criticism, of evaluation, of analysis that can lead to an objective statement. And again, picking certain, examples and trying to read from, an individualistic performance of a single champion, some kind of broader absolute quality of every single rank and file Celtic warrior out there, just means that you essentially do not know even what warfare is, right? Or how these people fought, or what they actually were. Because personally, aside my profession, I of course am attached to these. I have a reddish beard myself, by the way, so I surely have Celtic. By the way, I'm taking some genetic test, by the way. That's very interesting to me, and I will possibly let you know. But my greatest, sort of personal, if you want, even emotional side of the story is that, of course, I care about them, and I want to render these people the service of describing them accurately, and not using them as some sort of propaganda poster for post-traditional ideas that practically have nothing to do with what these people actually believed in much more radical ways than, in fact, the ways that are normally represented in pop culture, this kind of weird phrenesthetic hype without any kind of expertise or competence on the subject. Now, we do not too much about the single individual groups. When you, in fact, split them into tribes, you have just a bunch of information here and there, mostly indirect and without too much details on it. So talking about the Galatians is mostly recognizing their role in essentially the Hellenistic world up to the Roman conquest, and partly beyond, as a client state that does not seem to have accomplished more than much. At the end of the day, during the Mithridatic Wars, for example, the Galatian split, doesn't seem that this was a particular problem for Rome, not that the Pontics particularly benefited from this. So overall, were we to characterize the Galatians, there is really a few at the end of the day, but hints from here and there can provide us with a more compact view of the war. In 280 BC, certain Celtic tribes from Central Europe, or at least through the Hellenistic radar emerging from the Balkans, launched an invasion of Macedon, Hellas, and Thrace, fielding an army estimated to be composed by Pausanias, in his description of Hellas, Book 10, of an unlikely 61,200 cavalry and 152,000 infantry. This is naturally an exaggeration. Why is it an exaggeration? Well, first of all, there isn't something like more than 60,000 men strong army in Antiquity that you can sort of tactically control. You can have large amounts of people migrating and being peoples in arms, like in the case of the Celtic tribes, but this still doesn't mean that we can talk about more than a few hundred of thousands, if we count together with them women, the elderly, children, right? The more likely figure here is something between 20, 50,000 total warriors, because this was a big migration. Cavalry numbering likely in the low thousands rather than in the tens of thousands. We don't have, however, to underplay the importance of cavalry among the Celts. Surely this ratio that is more than 1 to 3 cavalry to infantry is suspicious. Of course, it's possible, especially looking at the geography of it. The Balkans were sort of much more steppe influenced areas than we tend to assume. Look at the Thracians, especially the ones inhabiting on the left bank of the Danube. High ratio of cavalry in their force. I have something coming about the Thracians as well. However, speaking of the Celts, these were much more, and that is not so much of a compliment, right? Because we know that the more you move to the steppe, the more you move to somewhere more nomadic, you're actually looking at a weaker reality, right? You can have more warlike peoples, but less functional. The steppes are the steppes exactly because they are fringe of civilization. When you look at the Celts instead, you're looking, especially at this point, at pretty sound, good, cohesive people by, again, tribal standards of the time. They're pretty warlike. They have these forces to spend. The 280 invasion of Greece is actually one of those a bit last examples, but still, of this phenomenon. And their bias was normally, surely in favor, culturally wise, of cavalry. All their heroes, this is true for all the sedentary peoples in Europe, like the Indo-European background especially, prevalently shouts equestrian hero everywhere. But given the social segmentation, the fact that the Celts didn't have an overwhelming surplus, a large amount of cavalry is unlikely, unless we're talking, and this is possible, an addition of auxiliary cavalry from these more steppe influence areas in, like, tendentially towards Eastern Europe and Balkans, that, however, may not exactly be, in fact, like a great. They're mostly raiders. Like, it's not speaking much of the actual structure of the Celtic hosts. Having said this, it is still possible that this invasion in particular had a sounder cavalry presence, especially considering the broader Danubian world that was in a way or another exposed to the steppes around the Carpathians. Think about the later Zygas, that sort of Danubian to Carpathian corridor that stretched from north to south, was a bit this wedge between the later Roman Pannonian and Dacia that was constantly infiltrated by these nomads. We talked about the boy in another video, and we discussed there the relation with the Pannonians. We've seen the steppes influence also in the video about the Skordiski. We talked about the Dacians. So we do know that area of Europe was surely more equestrianly influenced at large. But if that is the case, it doesn't come from some sort of heavier, sturdier feudal backbone of these cavalry forces. It mostly comes from something lighter in bias. It's still very important for Pausanias to have left us with this figure, right? By the way, the Hellenic victory at the Battle of Thermopylae in 279 BC against these Celtic invaders, led by Brennus, was one of the standard names of Celtic chieftains, further supports a smaller figure, as a force of over 200,000, like Pausanias says, would have likely overwhelmed the defending coalition of Hellenic states despite their strategic advantage. This means what, by the way? That what we could at some point make a more in-depth video about the 280 BC invasion. There are lots of interesting things happening at that point in history. This is in parallel to Pyrrhus' invasion of Italy, the wars with the Romans. You know that the so-called Tureos, and I made a video about the Tureophoroi in Hellas, was, let's say, derived from exactly these years, both Celtic invasion and the essentially expatriation of Oscan mercenaries in Pyrrhus' service after the essentially failed campaign in Italy. So this is a time of change. This is also in the backdrop of an Hellenistic world that is definitely transforming a bit what had been the warfare of the previous centuries. The Celts being part of this, as we will see now, and especially the Galatians, who had this more eastern settlement, having to survive among pretty big Hellenistic powers. Think about the Seleucids, or the same Macedon to some extent, because, as we said before, part of these Celts settled also in the Balkans, withdrawing from Hellas. Some rose up the Danube, again, as we've seen, others go over to Galatia, and you have, in general, lots of war bands that are hired, firing wide across the Mediterranean. And the Galatians, being, again, the most eastern biased, were usually present, as we'll see now, in the Levant as well. One day we'll talk more and better about specific battles and or like military units, so we also understand what they looked like. Of course, here I don't know what kind of pictures I used yet for this video, because I really have to edit it, but I normally collect all the Celtic pictures, because at the end of the day they were in origin, but also in the later phases, pretty similar to one another. They may have been, as always, like especially in this case, adaptations, imports, local craftsmanship influenced by Hellenistic arms and armor especially, but the essence of these Celtic hosts remain pretty much the same, the way of fighting, which we will understand partly better now. Today we don't talk tactics, this is just for the armies organization series. Following their defeat in Hellas, some of these Celtic tribes formed the kingdom of Toulouse in Thrace. So they followed essentially the northeastern route. They came back north, but they began going east. And in fact, three other tribes, the Tectosages, the Trochmi, and the Tolistobogi, crossed the straits into Asia. So they continued essentially towards the east. They ultimately settled in the Phrygian plateau, which came to be referred to at that point as Galatia, where they formed a loosely organized tribal federation that dominated the local Phrygian peasantry and conducted raids into surrounding areas. This aspect is quite fascinating for a number of reasons. The first one is that this interland is not exactly the best area around the by far more developed parts of Anatolia are the coastal ones, but of course the Celts would have simply not been accepted. They should have sort of destroyed local civilization that was too much amidst powerful Hellenistic kingdoms. This is essentially what happened in Hellas as well. They probably neither thought that they would simply settle there. At large, there was a lot of adventurism that, especially in these migrations, was very military in nature. There are some accounts from the Battle of the Thermopylae that really show that also the select element of these troops at the time. We know of Celtic warriors fighting still with javelins stuck, in their torso, passing them from side to side, and there's a general sense of ferocity emanating from the Celtic host that definitely strikes for the audacity, right, the boldness of having even reached so far. As they profanated the temple of Delphi. It was considered the root of the world since the Dorian Indo-European invasions in Hellas. They end up being crushed, in fact, by the Greeks at the end of the day. However, we shouldn't even imagine, of course, that the Celts had at this point much of a sort of pre-planned idea where they could have settled. It mostly was about breaking through with this typical Celtic impetus and seeing what opportunities would open for them, so that that war-bending element was stronger, I would say, especially in this migration, than others in the past. It had also involved a greater Damic component that was, however, also present here. It's a bit like the Cimbri and the Teutones. They began roaming Europe back and forth just in search of further plunder and a land where to settle at some point, but also having the idea of potentially coming back where they had originated. Of course, the south, the Mediterranean, was just by far the best place where they could live. So again, it's always the history of these more primitive hinterlands. At some point, they cannot sustain as many people in a single place. They are very loaded for this reason, very competitive, very warlike. They have to survive in this system, so they decided to invest everything in a massive breakthrough, in some settlement into other people's lands. And as you understand here, a few succeeded, but the Galatians are among them. In fact, the other interesting aspect here is that, of course, Galatia was not this explosion of development by Hellenistic standards, let's say. Nevertheless, for Celtic ones, was definitely a very, very developed place. And the Galatians installed themselves as some sort of overlords on the local populace that at large has been not necessarily demilitarized, but say I made the case for this in a recent video about the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, as also these would become, that at large these Levantine peoples had been habituated being part of somebody else's rule, right, from the kings of kings to Alexander. It's true that Anatolia was historically a bit more tribal, a bit more warlike, a bit more Indo-European, by the way, but over time things had fundamentally changed. And although I made multiple videos about some even few centuries old at this point tribes that we mostly recounted from the Atlantic, from the Achaemenid sources, right, from that era, they were just, in fact, subjects of the time, but they had also gradually exhausted a bit that militarized ethos themselves. It's true that the Anatolian hinterland would remain home to a bit more warlike peoples historically. The fact that the Galatians themselves settled there, as we will see now, doing what? Essentially attempting to test the boundaries of their neighbors, but without too much success, because there wasn't fundamentally any major expansion after the settlement, still shows that, of course, this Galatians weren't all Celts. Especially the more time passed, the more locals would have been co-opted in these kind of adventures, so to say. There is, and we've seen this in multiple videos for multiple times and places in history, a sort of knightly bias of, we mostly understand these guys as just free men. Everybody was equal. They lived in a heavily seigneurial mindset in which every person was fundamentally different by their own individual value. And they really did consider themselves, especially in the first generations after the conquest, as a superior race come to rule over these people that were evidently already too gentrified and meek, rendered meek compared to the same Celts. So they literally installed themselves as warlords, deriving from the locals mostly the necessary resources in order to wage war in terms of supplies, logistics, but also, of course, some local forces. Anatolia was a land of mountaineers historically that were not, in fact, that meek at all, but at the same time they were sort of scattered. They were not intensely militarized in the way the Celts coming from Central Europe were historically at this point, right? So we are in roughly, the defeat at Delphi is in 279. These groups have cross into Asia Minor around 278 BC under leaders like Leonorius and Lutarius. Also, this is interesting too, at the invitation of Nicomedes I of Bithynia, who sought their aid as mercenaries against his rivals. They established, as we've seen, as a sort of federation of Tectosages, Tolistobogi, and the Trocmi that will come to be known collectively in the region as the Galatians. In fact, how many were they? We'll understand this better from the accounts of Livy. The Romans essentially coped against enemies that counted at times a few tens of thousands warriors in a major regional engagement. So we're looking at essentially a basic regional force of some sort. Like ancient and medieval times do not differ that much. If you can field 20, 30,000 fighters and or like an army more or less of that size with field aids and so on, you are basically squeezing an entire regional dimension that these Celts do not, as we've seen, even control in a unitary sense, but as a mostly as a union of different tribes that are also not always agreeing with one another. We do not know exactly how many Celtic warriors Nicomedes had invited in what was technically Phrygia, as we've seen. Perhaps 10 to 15,000 fighting men accompanied by an equal number of dependents. We can, however, think that while the Galatians remained a minority ruling class over the larger native Phrygian population, over time this initial endemic pool grew through natural increase, and even this additional migrations may have even continued over time because different war bands at that point would have also arrived from other parts of the Celtic war that we can't properly track. So that by the end, say by the 2nd century BC, the total population in Galatia may have reached 50 to 100,000. That would allow, with a pretty high level, a relatively high level of militarization for the times and places, mostly again due to the Celtic protagonism in this, fielded something like between 20-30,000 troops. All right. By 189 BC, and we'll look at the battle later a bit, the initial force of 20,000 Celtic warriors had reportedly expanded. We're told that the Galatians fielded against the Romans that had just taken over western Asia Minor after their victory over the Seleucids at Magnesia. Reportedly fielded 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, just by the way from the Trocmi and Tectosages tribes. It's likely that this force was inflated by Livy, that in his History of Rome book 38 provides with the most detailed ancient account of the Galatians' military strength when they faced the Roman consul Gnaeus Manlius Vulso. The Romans won clamorously, so there may be this much that, of course, we grasp from classical sources and general storytelling, also in other periods and places, that, of course, the Celtic host may have been over-counted in terms of properly manpower. This is a more, say, realistic, at least, assessment of what still a pretty consistently cavalry endowed Celtic army would have looked like, mounted and foot. Because we will see now how some of these Celtic horsemen did dismount in order to fight. By the way, this is yet another interesting aspect that I think it's very underrated. I mean, we should obviously understand how important cavalry tactics were in general in antiquity, also among like tribal forces. But there is a lot of skirmishing, a lot of raiding, and this is the most preferable way most tribesmen, especially these from Central Europe, would have engaged. Like cavalry is important. Pretty much everywhere is seen like, okay, you are mounted, you can escape more more easily from the battlefield if things go wrong. Instead, even just because of the aforementioned general lack of political cohesion, the chieftains had to lead by example and showing their warriors that they would essentially dismount and fight with them in order to prove he was not going anywhere, that he would have stood his ground or died. This is, by the way, at the time in which Celtic warfare is still very, it's not really heroic anymore. We can say that at large, 3rd century BC, this more ideally, tendentially heroic champion-based warfare was something mostly just existing in Britain, British Isles, and that's also not a compliment in terms of overall military effectiveness. As a matter of fact, the British Celts were the ones with the lowest military quality. The highest was among the Belgians, among the Helvetii, right? The Galatians were apparently pretty standard, right? In any case, going back to Livy's numbers, it's not just that they're somehow rounded and focus on the combined strength of the tribes just by saying, okay, these were lots of guys, right? But probably overestimated the force of these Celts. The battle is a resounding Roman victory over the Tectosages and the Trocmi, right? The Roman forces, stiffened by the Attalid ones, had arrived to Magaba, and the Galatians set up an ambush there, launching a surprise attack with 1,000 elite cavalry during the same negotiations. This is interesting because it would seem that they counted just on a section of the cavalry. Remember, here it's literally 1/10, according to Livy's figures. So, like, if you have consistent cavalry and you want to do this, even though you will have reserves, you would probably have some larger numbers. The Roman foragers were able to fend off these aggressors, by the way, which is also not really highlighting the quality of this cavalry at the end of the day, because foragers are not even supposed to probably withstand a functional military force as they're scattered out there. This is even supposed to be elite cavalry, so not really one you could simply cope with just sort of still soldiers but scattered across the countryside. Also, the Celts deploy on a mountain with the 50,000 infantry in the centers and 10,000 dismounted cavalry positioned on their right flank. So essentially acting as another part of the phalanx. There are 4,000 allied troops from the regions of Cappadocia and Paphlagonia that are stationed on the left flank. We'll talk about these later. And after conducting a detailed reconnaissance, the Romans arranged for light infantry backed by heavy infantry to assault the center while dispatching 2 additional columns to engage the flanks, which seems, by the way, not just a typical Roman tactics of the time. You know how the Romans during the Second Punic War had, especially under Scipio, really distinguished themselves in this very highly collectively coordinated as successful tactics against the enemy flanks, but also the fact that the Celts themselves didn't have too many countermeasures. As a matter of fact, they were more than the Romans, apparently. They have these troops stationed on the flanks that are also dismounted cavalry, which do not sound, therefore, as that dynamic and capable of countering the Roman forces, trying to outflank them in turn, etc. On the contrary, the Celts have chosen an all-defensive profile. Probably this adds up relatively to the theory that probably these Celts were not as many as the Romans were saying. Nevertheless, they're also not very tactically qualitative. They do not do anything. Of course, like for these battles, we just have this relatively short accounts. At some point when we will make an entire video about this battle that is very, very interesting. Basically, the Romans soften up the Celtic ranks with heavy missile fire, literally dispiriting them and making them collapse as soon as the Roman heavy infantry charged. The wings, anticipating the Roman flanking forces, also gave way during the initial charge. Galatian losses totaled 8,000, with the majority occurring during the pursuit phase. Now this is very interesting. Why do we talk about this? Of course, you cannot simply separate army organizations from tactics, say, because if we look at the actual quality of these forces, that's what I was saying in the beginning, we realize that these Celts didn't go too far, right? Here, again, we rely on just one source. It's, of course, a biased source. Like any other, had the Celts written something, would have been biased in their favor, but there is no major systematic conspiracy theory validating any sort of, there was this magic military force that suddenly was not just disappearing for making the Romans win, right? The Romans took over the area. We know that, again, it wasn't much of a problem anymore. This engagement took place in the first place. It's because they tried, the Celts tried, but they failed. This happens often in history. I remember there is an interview that I made almost 1 year ago, and that wasn't aired, about Lithuanian warfare, the Battle of Blue Waters. I was asked by the interviewer, but do you think the Battle of Blue Waters actually even happened? Because it's just like a Renaissance tale in the way it's documented. And the point is that if we study like the times and the places, suddenly the Golden Horde collapses in that region exactly after the Battle of Blue Waters. The Lithuanians came to rule over Ruthenia. Even if that Renaissance account was invented, the political, historical, military fundamentals of that are under the sun. You can't. Something must have happened. What happened? The Golden Horde simply said, "Oh, sorry," and retreated, and the Lithuanians came to rule over there. So this is the same. And this is also why a diachronic comparative approach to military history is required. You must understand that, of course, we're looking at forces that you may cheer for, depending on who you like or dislike for whichever subjective reasons, but you cannot change the basic historical reality that, yes, the Romans were more advanced, and that this reflected itself as the Hellenistic kingdoms were more advanced respectively in this Galatian defeat, for example, or the fact that they live in a relatively marginalized area, right? So this information is quite fascinating, especially, again, the fact that the entire cavalry dismounted apparently to fight in defense is interesting, because if we assume, in fact, the Romans to have been also inferior in number, the need to dismount, right, to deny properly any maneuvering capacity to your own forces is otherwise inexplainable. We've seen this in other battles, like, I don't know, the ones of the 100 Years' War. The English were in significant inferiority in order to decide to dismount and fight on foot at large, also with the men, especially with the men at arms, as the French were just overwhelmingly superior, so they preferred to exploit the defensive over like the obvious detrimental factor of giving up the initiative, because at least from a strictly defensive point of view you can get that advantage that you may hopefully, if the fight is successful, eventually spend for a counterattack, as it happened there. Here it's mostly like the Celts simply realized that the Romans were qualitatively superior and decided to take this incredibly defensive formation, and losing even. It's not the first time we see similar things. Think about the Battle of Mons Graupius, other battle that not just I covered, but that people every once in a while say, "Oh no, it's not true. This battle never existed because just one source talks about it." And what does that exactly mean? right? That, what is also implausible in such descriptions, because it turns out all these battles are actually very coherent in the way they're narrated, even if we don't know what the sources were, even if we know that they would have existed. Of course, the world, first of all, knew about history. It's not like these were the only sources, nor people were not aware of what was happening at the time. So even the mere idea of falsification is a bit naive, and it's frankly something that I've heard only from mostly the Anglosphere, where scholarship apparently is like a bunch of gods descended from heaven, and sources are just now, they're all made up and whatever. This is a very unfair and anti-scientific attitude, as a matter of fact. Sources are always being listened to, and if you follow my sort of Hellenistic warfare, this ancient warfare content, like when we analyze specifically this type of historiography, because in medieval times things start changing, because there are closer times, there were often more advanced times than we think, so we have a lot of information about the Middle Ages in comparison. For the ancient world, it's true, we have these few sources, but when you study them, when you confront the various versions, even when you realize that something doesn't ring correct and there are issues, misunderstanding, this is especially true in certain ways. I explained this especially in the video about the Battle of the Allia River, in which there was all a technicality about weapons, considering the sources were talking about that. But for the rest, everything can be deciphered in that sense, but everything at large makes a lot of sense, right? There is nothing that comes out of the blue, pigs are flying or whatever. Everything fits with what we know of these military cultures archaeologically, but also in overwhelmingness, it's always the most important thing from the rest of documentary evidence from different authors, different people. And history went that direction, so I wouldn't be that sort of that of a problem. There has been some attempt in assessing what would have been the total Galatian military capacity in 189 BC, considering not just the aforementioned tribes, as if we're counting all the tribes of Galatia, right? And Scholar, for example, thought of 60 to 80,000, right? The Trochme and the Tectosages, just like at this battle, constituting the bulk of it, and so the majority actually of this force. However, still, because we would be again 50,000 infantry plus 10,000 cavalry makes 60,000, so we would have added another smaller tribe compared to the bigger ones in the Federation. We could have reached 80,000, but we could have actually fielded 80,000 men. It seems just like excessive for the Trochme and the Tectosages to have actually had 60,000 on the field, right? So at large, yes, that can be an exaggeration. That's actually adding to Celtic quality. Of course, if you increase the numbers, you're also diluting the quality. But also the scale is very often telling, and again, doesn't seem like, of course, these Celts could have put up much of a struggle against the Roman legions of the early 2nd century BC. Now, initially, and that is not to say that they could have not defeated the Romans. Absolutely, these battles were fought exactly because, if people had already known or already given for granted the result, they would have not even needed to fight to begin with. It's not like the Romans didn't suffer defeats at the hands of the Celts also later on in history, but at large we know what happened, right? So the trend is quite eloquent. There is another aspect about Galatian warfare that is quite fascinating, partly tied to the original Celtic military culture and to some Hellenistic one at the same time. In fact, they were told to have possessed 160 traditional two-horse chariots, as well as 80 seated ones, probably, so scholars think, obtained while in Galatia from the neighboring Seleucid Empire. We're talking around 273 BC. This is fascinating because there are some battle trophies, as you know, at the very extensive monumental evidence in Attalid Pergamon. Trophies carved here early 2nd century depict a chariot yoke. It's possible that the Galatian lack of chariots in the battles against Rome in 189 may have been influenced by the mountainous terrain that we described on that occasion. That, of course, was not the ideal for especially extensive use of chariot warfare. I made a video about Brittonic chariots of the Iron Age. We have seen there how, of course, in that still heroic, so to say, military space that the Brittonic one was, it was a lot of individualism because, of course, it wasn't a particularly large-scale military development, and so the individual counted more in a smaller context. And of course, individually, and we can think that this was true also for the Galatians, of course, because we don't have to think that lack of collective strength is lack of individual strength, but the former is more important than the latter. Would have been excellent at performing stunts on chariots. We know that the Britons were particularly good at that, and so they would have even been good at using these chariots on rugged terrain individually. But when you have to, of course, maneuver on large units like on this terrain, we're talking about a very different picture, which, like, the effectiveness of the entire tactic is based on the cohesion of these forces, and chariots are not that easy to maneuver in large formations, let alone on pretty tough terrain, right? So as we've seen there, even cavalry that is more agile, decided to dismount to fight. You can imagine the chariots there not having necessarily, that there might have been, I mean, it would have not been strange, telling the truth, to have seen one of those engagements, but more like a side dish, not as a powerful arm that we're not in fact even told of. While of course we're told of chariot warfare in, like, for example, for the year prior at Magnesia, where the Attalid allies of the Romans fenced off that arm of the Seleucids by peppering the enemy horses, and even having them running amok against the same Seleucid lines, causing a disaster. All right. In any case, chariot warfare is not a particularly sound indicator of military development at this point. The great Hellenistic chariots, like the ones used at Magnesia, were launched at full speed like mobile fortresses, and they didn't even try to be maneuverable anymore. It was all about the size, the fact that these gigantic Hellenistic kingdoms like the Seleucid one could have the funds to use them together with elephants and other, marvels, let's say, warfare that, as Magnesia proved, by the way, did not really achieve too much. When we look at Celtic chariot warfare that survived, in fact, in Britain as well, and I have something coming about the Romano-Brittonic Wars, by the way, as a series, but I already discussed Brittonic warfare to some extent. We explained there what chariot warfare was about. It's something that pertains to the fringe of Europe, right? And say, just, I don't know, the Garamantes used chariots at this point in North Africa, like the Mediterranean. Central Europe at large had abandoned chariots. You find them just in the less developed areas. So while we definitely see from different sources that the Galatians would have made use of war chariots, this doesn't mean that they were such an enormous component of their warfare. They would have, again, been relatively updated. I mean, if they are there, it's because they functioned in a way or another. So it was not just a foolish idea to use them at all. They were effective to a degree, but at large, as you know, chariots were very vulnerable from missile troops. They didn't have the potential properly to destroy heavy infantry. You've seen how even the Britons that mastered that craft could do a few against the Romans. That had stronger, tougher infantries, and at large, the objective was to smash with the entire chariot suicidally, to try to create gaps, to exploit in some ways, to disorder the enemy formation, but it didn't end too well for them. So at large, we can't think that the Galatians would have developed at this point like Levantine powers. Doesn't matter whether Celtic base in this case, like the normal sort of cavalry infantry combo that would have stayed that way and tendentially developed ever more as chariot warfare was basically declining. Celtic chariots were smaller than the Hellenistic ones. They were also, in fact, not very frequently used at this point in battle, right? In the same year, 280 BC, going back to, in fact, the original invasion, several Hellenic noblemen from Thessaly and Ionia, the latter being a region of ancient Hellas located near Lamia in modern central Greece, roughly corresponding to the upper valley of the Spercheios River, along with their followers, aligned themselves with the Galatian invasion. This is also fascinating. When there is mess, especially in sort of a bit more fragmented areas politically wise, you have people saying, okay, these guys are coming to plunder. We shouldn't sort of fight against the collective interests of the system just to facilitate their way, but hey, those guys are plundering our enemies, or at least our rivals or our neighbors. Let's do that too. I've seen this often in medieval history as well. So this is just for the record. Could there have been essentially Hellenic allies among the Celts, including troops that may have kept following these people in Galatia later on? Yeah, right. Wouldn't be so strange. At least you would have seen other Hellenes next to the enemies of the Galatians, fighting alongside with them. It seems that some members of the Paiones tribe in northern Greece joined this migration into Asia. This is evidenced by a Lycian city's account of being liberated, quote, from the Galatians and the Paiones. By the way, liberated because in practice they were under somebody else's rule, the Adochoi kingdom, and as such they would have made counterculture against by helping these barbarians. By the way, the Paiones, we will talk about them. They lived in this sort of valley of the Vardar river. They are distinguished from the still similar Thracians, Macedonians, Hellenes, and Illyrians. They're not overwhelmingly civilized peoples. Actually, they're practically tribesmen, so we count them among the barbarians at this point rather than other Greeks. Nevertheless, we understand that, of course, these migrations came together with a greater sense of let's say political international shadow of some sort. Like, we are the destroyers of civilizations. We are rough, we're tough, we're violent, we're vicious, we plunder, we destroy. Whoever gets in our way gets exterminated or enslaved. The Hellenistic kingdoms that controlled the area were the bulwark against this kind of phenomenon. Speaking of other foreigners, so to say, in the Galatian armies, we have seen how in the clash with Rome in 189, the Galatians received support from 4,000 Cappadocians and mercenaries from the king of Paphlagonia. We do not know too well what kind of forces this would have been, at least because the source does not actually tell us. Of course, when talking about those peoples, we will stereotype them a bit more. These were essentially other Anatolian populations that mostly used non-Hellenistic warfare methods. They were, especially Paphlagonia, heavily influenced by them. But you remember always the Macedonian warfare can be sustained by a large regional force. Not even the Attalids actually ever had apparently a Macedonian phalanx on their own, because it was too expensive. They were too small. So these Eastern powers were mostly about some more feudal bias. There was a lot of Persian influence as well, cataphracts of sort, mountaineers from the hilly and mountainous, in fact, interland, skirmishers of all kinds. This is an area from which the Hellenistic kingdoms drew many of what were called Tureophoroi, right? Aside from the local sort of regulars that were armed that way, but the Anatolian hinterland had lots of these pretty basic, spearmen / javeliner that were just that good in that hilly, mountainous terrain. The Galatians would have essentially made use of those as well, and just had troops on their own that were very similar to those since the beginnings. By the way, Galatians were used, and this is basically what they're mostly famous around the Eastern Mediterranean, as mercenaries. Right? Galatians were hired particularly by the Antigonid Macedons. The pick was under Antigonus Gonatas. However, Antigonus Doson did have 1,000 Galatian infantry at the Battle of Seleucia against the Achaean League, and Perseus of Macedon employed 2,000 Galatians in 169 BC. We're talking important numbers, so it's difficult to understand here whether we're talking about Galatians from Galatia proper, because Galatia is, as you know, the Galatians are essentially connected with the Celts, etymologically speaking. We do not understand the sense of whether this were some Danubian Celts that they also called themselves Galatian. This was a synecdoche to understand the broader variety of Celts remaining more or less straddling as warbanders the straits. In any case, these were mostly, in fact, professional troops, in the sense at least of warbands. So people roamed the world, gaining considerable military experience, to say the least, therefore being more reliable, being more devoted to their general purpose. We've seen how physically tough they were. We talked a lot about war bands on Schwerpunkt, not too much about these. Once I made a video about the Gallic warbander, but we'll have to come back on what specifically Celtic military religion to understand this more fully. You know, the Galatians were at large understood as those who would never surrender, who would prefer to kill themselves and their women rather than falling into enemy hands. And they had this very sort of borderline relation, so to say the least, with death, at least trying to achieve the Mors Triumphalis, and so the heavenly reward in the afterlife for self-sacrifice in holy combat. I would say that the Danubian Celts, as they had appeared from the 280 invasion, had a more primitively brutal strike of sort. Like, they did come from areas that were somehow less civilized compared to Gaul, for example. You know that the Celts fundamentally expanded from places like today's Austria, Switzerland, as the very core of their originary, because of the main waves from which they started invading Southern Europe. All right, this, of course, entails a previous history of Proto-Celtic and lots of other things, including Proto-Italic, Proto-Germanic era and migrations from the originary Indo-European one and Yamnaya especially. However, aside from the fact that the Celts that invaded Greece and Asia Minor were more mixed, as we've seen, with Eastern branches, and so also with populations of Indo-European ancestry that, however, had a different history from the Celtic one. Say the Danubian side, the eastern, say, part of the Celts were tendentially less developed than the western ones. All right, the Gallic, the Italian ones, those were the better interconnected with the rest of the world, the richest. Of course, like in Central Europe, there were important centers, a great deal of wealth, especially before the Germans arrived to raise everything to the ground, including the Dacians in part. But that also reflects how more vulnerable actually those systems really were, how at large less developed also they were, maintaining a bit more of stubbornness, of toughness. And this is, in fact, the one that you see in part in these eastern migrations that were for actually worse lands at large, because let's be honest, the best lands in the West already at the time, continentally wise, were really Gaul, Spain, Italy, and the other direction was in the east, just closer to the steppe, expanding to less civilized areas. In fact, at this point we see the Celts can do just so much against the Greeks and or pass into Asia Minor, settling, by the way, in the hinterland, for which they don't really do anything else later on. So they weren't really, from a strictly military point of view, after the settlement, any clamorous, distinguished, let's say, tribal group per se, from a military point of view. And they were pretty standard, pretty average. But you see them serving, again, around both Galatians and Thracians, highlighting how, again, this Balkan and Anatolian regions were interconnected at this point. Consider that the Thracians, what we call the Phrygians, that were in part this, debatably, this what would become this Galatian subjects, were Thracian themselves, so they straddled the straits. And the Galatians were there in between. There were, especially Paphlagonia, as we've seen, the same Phrygians. There were slightly less civilized places. They had a deficit of public authority, civic culture, so it was easier to find war bands in these areas. And Galatians and Thracians were recruited as settlers and mercenaries as well. Right? For example, we know that at the Battle of Raphia, it is Rafah, 4,000 settlers fought alongside 2,000 newly recruited mercenaries, likely referred to as mercenary klerukoi. What does this mean? It means that essentially, here we're talking from the Egyptian side, from the Ptolemaic side, not the Seleucid one, but it would have been true also for them to some extent, is that, and I made a video about the Ptolemaic army organization and recruitment system. They were literally being a military colonist at some point, arriving maybe as warbanders and receiving some land by the pharaohs of Hellenistic Egypt. We've seen how there were even, Italic soldiers, we know as military settlers in Ptolemaic Egypt, right? So there was all peoples that were historically roaming around the Mediterranean as mercenaries. I will make some videos about Italic mercenaries and how, in part, Rome overshadowed their maritime activities across the Mediterranean, sort of claiming her eventually controlled the Mare Nostrum as a sort of Romanocentric accomplishment, let's put it in this way. It's also true, by the way, that the Ptolemies, however, at this point, controlled part of the Thracian coast in the Marmara Sea. Specifically, Lysimacheia was one of the cities founded by the Symmachos, was in Ptolemaic hands. So this was essentially an Egyptian enclave between the Attalids, the Antigonids, the Odrysian kingdom, these other, like the Paphlagonians, the Phrygians, etc. And from there, the Egyptians, that made, as we've seen, a greater use of mercenaries compared to from their fellow Diadochoi, made extensive use of Galatians recruited from these areas. Of course, again, these guys could have been found even as far as Egypt, except warband would have really been hired as they were passing by. Naturally, the Hellenic polis controlled by these various Diadochoi on the coastland were a bit the opening to the broader Mediterranean market, so to say, so it was easier from there to reach Egypt than, say, especially as Lysimacheia remained in Ptolemaic control, than going through land, right? So we're not necessarily talking just about, say, the political will of the Galatian Federation in Asia Minor. Those would have surely aligned themselves with different powers at different times. That were a bit like the difference between the ZIP and the Comitatus, where you would have these war bands regularly going out there, being connected to the Galatian nobility, and more. Being there so many opportunities abroad that at that point could also be seized just regardless of any deeper specific political alignment, considering also as the same Galatian tribes were often quarreling with one another. We know that the Galatians contributed to the Ptolemaic garrison at Ephesus during the 3rd century, as well as in Cyprus. So again, relatively close lands to the same Galatia, that would offer opportunities for these garrisons also to root locally, to increase trade with the surrounding polities and more. The Galatians were first contracted as mercenaries in Egypt by Ptolemy II as early as 274 BC, showing how far and wide since the first year the Galatians had gone. Ptolemy employed 4,000 Galatians to fight against his rebellious brother Magus in Kyrenae. I made a video about the history of the Roman province of Kyrenaica with a minimal background. This was essentially like a vassal state of Egypt that, however, was distant enough with the Libyan desert in between, but colonized but historically by the Greeks, and connecting with the bigger center being Egypt. Close to that, they were sometimes infested by the Carthaginians that had connections with Greece, but at large they were exploiting that to be a bit more autonomous. However, these Galatians were insubordinate and were abandoned on a barren river island to starve by the Ptolemies. This is quite interesting because in a way it's of course like highlighting the expected lack of generalized respect towards hierarchy, towards order that these tribal warriors coming from Central Europe would have exhibited, especially at this point in history. On the other hand, you have them really as a problem. Also, you should pay them in theory, but this is more like a punishment for their behavior. They're let starving to death on an island without much, as you understand here, as a nautical capacity of their own, of getting out of there. They had been brought and left there by the Ptolemaic navy. The Hellenistic kingdoms, as you know, had pretty advanced naval power. We will talk about this surely in the series about ancient navies. After settling in Asia, the Galatian tribes began to be hired also by the Seleucids that were just south, right? You have Cilicia in the south of Galatia, the Taurus Mountains, being partially, not really controlled by the Galatians very much, but sort of being very close. And the Galatians first appeared in Seleucid service under Seleucus II's reign. We are between 247 and 226 BC. During the rule of Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, Galatian infantry participated at the Battle of Apollonia in 220 BC in Media against the rebel satrap / was another Seleucid leader Molon, and at the Magnesia in 190 BC. In the latter, providing 3,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. Regarding the latter numbers, Livy, I made, some of you asked me about Magnesia specifically, I made mini reconstruction of the battle in that video about the Manipular Legion versus Macedonian phalanx. I think it's just much simpler than it seems. Like, people go around making these videos on YouTube, pretending to rediscover battles studied since 2000 years just because, I don't know, they can project an incredibly debatable array of spaced array of troops on, terrain map. It doesn't make any sense. In any case, the numbers here are interesting for us because we've seen that at least Livy was also the source for the later battle, in which all the Galatians, at least most of them, participated against Rome. And here you have, so the same source given the same standard, much smaller force that couldn't fit with the Seleucid one, that however is within the Seleucid one, that however was immense. Like, if you were to count all the troops that listed there, all the peoples coming from literally everywhere, from the Aryans to an insane amount. Here we find 2,500 cavalry and 3,000 infantry that can suggest that this was a picked unit of sort. Again, we get this knightly sense of the Galatian warrior, especially the mounted one, having retainers, having at this point subjects in Galatia, because they had literally become landed lords of some sort, and sending a bit the best, especially considering that they were trying to keep the Romans out, so they would have tried to help the Seleucid in a satisfactory way. So this is not representative as a cavalry infantry ratio, but the actual Galatian one, as we've seen, was much lower in the following battle, where there were more infantrymen, and the cavalry, by the way, dismounted to begin with. This is interesting, but again, if you make the maths of the entire Seleucid army, you realize it's too big, and even this force is 5,500. If we even consider just, a maximum of 50,000 used by the Seleucids, it's perhaps too big, right? Especially considering all the other peoples that are listed by Livy in others. And this is, again, how can you solve this? You don't. If you want to be military historically accurate, you have just to get what you can fundamentally interpret, as we've seen from the raw data, and trying to fit this in the broader picture, but as a general meaning, not in the sense that you have to square a circle, just because the source obviously can be inaccurate like any source of the era, and not because there is a bias aiming at distorting reality just per se. Livy was making a fair point overall in stressing the multitude the Seleucids could muster against the Romans. And yes, there may be a bias trope, whatever, but if you assess overall, like, the number of peoples that were fielded, the kind of proportions that are overall, if you don't take the absolute the absolute figures for real, you can still see, for example, the proportion between cavalry and infantry is very interesting, and the general relevance of these people in the coalition. In 165 BC, up to 5,000 Galatian infantry were present at the Daphne parade. This was a famous event in the Seleucid Empire. So we're fairly late in time. Like at this point, the Seleucids have been quite deteriorated. They're essentially a client state of Rome. In any case, this specific Galatian deployment would have violated the 189 BC treaty with Rome that forbade troop recruitment from the side of the Seleucids west of the Taurus Mountains. And this agreement happened in the same year in which just the Seleucids had been defeated, the previous one, but in which the Galatians are also defeated. So the sense is that Anatolia now was a Roman thing, including Galatia, and the Seleucids should have not, in fact, hired these troops for whichever purpose. They had, of course, a military one, but also a representative one. We'll talk more at some point about their equipment, because it's really interesting. We have also iconographic evidence from the Daphne parade. By the way, after their defeat at the hands of the Romans, the Galatians do not seem to have been deployed much around anymore. And if so, they did as mercenaries. Right, in the Roman war with Macedon in 171, 6,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry were involved, making it as the largest recorded Pergamene force, given that the kingdom of the Attalids was not a notable military power. But among the cavalry there were 200 Galatians, and an additional 1,000 had been sent to Hellas, though they were lost when their ships were captured by the Macedonians. So the Galatians keep participating, as we've seen also in the video about the Pergamene army organization, in this neighboring powers allied with Rome, by the way, because this is the point there that Pergamon was fighting as a loyal ally, as we've seen, against the same Galatians when these were still in force and capable of standing their ground against Rome, and the same Pergamon at that point. And again, for Rome through Pergamon later. And of course, Pergamon would have had a privileged access of Galatian to Galatian troops, except, as we've seen, there hadn't been much of an easy history between the two before, and so the relations may have been a bit strained, if we want to be a bit bad about sort of the interpretation of this all. Naturally, if we consider Galatian warfare in a broader sense, we could see like very interesting aspects, including the later assimilation of the Galatians in the Roman Empire, first as a client state, but in general as a pretty robust force in a cultural sense. We know that they had a sacred nemeton. We know that also in Christian times there would actually be a like a distinct form of heresy, let's say, stemming from the same Galatia, that in part was inspired to the aforementioned countercultural, tendentially dualistic, in fact anti-Catholic sense of that these French peoples actually had, at least when they confronted themselves with the real masters around. Otherwise, at home, they would have tried to push for that narrative, also in their elites, on a regular basis. There is, of course, much to appreciate in Galatian history, just for the very interesting geographical position with all these particular neighbors around, let's put it in this way, that truly informed also their way of war. However, regarding that, as we were saying at the beginning, it's not like the Galatian warfare was particularly altered by the encounter with the East. Quite the contrary. These peoples kept fighting essentially the way they always had. There wasn't really much of a change based on that dynamic. The way like political and social fundamentals can be altered normally occur only when there is a conquest from somebody else. In this case, it had been the Galatians who had conquered the locals, but also the general sense that the Romans would later take over. Like, in fact, these were cultures not really ruling from particularly civilized places, even in Asia Minor. They would have had, in this sense, partially less resistance because they were a simpler society. And we understand, of course, they would have changed to a degree, but we can't say that, of course, they differed in any significant way from other Celts in the ways they fought. As we have seen and understood here, they had a substantial amount of cavalry, which is typical of Celtic warfare. The Gauls, in particular, had lots of cavalry, really obsessed with that, but also the others didn't kid, as we've seen with this possibly larger amount of initial followers from the steppes that sort of added to it in lighter forms. There is, in this sense, not likely a particularly strong cavalry capacity, even in the truly elite element. We've seen it before against the Romans. They didn't go very, very far to begin with. They would even dismount to fight, so at large they followed the standards of Celtic cavalry that was mostly also put together, not according to particularly strong national connections. In fact, these peoples were, again, the strongest Celts were the Belgians, the Helvetii, right? And also the Romans took them out fairly easily, right? So we look at the Galatians, we realize that their cohesion was based on local clans, local, just the local villages, and plus this war bands, but they didn't have really a great deal of further societal cohesion to provide, for example, cavalry with a better understanding of who they were fighting next to, because mostly, as we've seen, there wasn't even too much cavalry from a numerical point of view, and the one that existed was coming from relatively scattered areas. So if these leaders were capable even of putting anyone together in terms of like properly an army of decent size, which of course they were capable of, but they would have taken troops from so many faraway places without too much like professional background, as mostly they were levies. And for this reason, not really knowing, given the scarcity of collective training or resources for that to begin with, this collective training necessary to maintain a veritable cohesion for cavalry in the field. This is really what tribal society is, right? As it's not a state and it doesn't work as one, and it's less effective as a consequence. So we've seen that this matches with what we know from the sources, right? This Celtic cavalry didn't even have much chance to operate, to maneuver. We find actually other situations, again, in Gaul, in Italy, in which this was not true. Like, they had good cavalry, but again, it was a different world. It was a better world for them. This we explained this also recently in that video about the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. The fact that the Hellenistic world was richer along the coasts does not mean that the hinterland was particularly developed at all. And so what we see at large at most is some kind of the actually backward world especially in the Asia, the Anatolian hinterland, that was exactly the place where people like the Celts would have been let to settle by other the neighbors that, as we've seen, also didn't really suffer much from the settlement. I mean, it doesn't seem like the Galatians were a particular threat to anyone in the region on the longer run. They tried against the Romans because they realized that that may have been a moment just to lengthen their own lifespan, say as a politically independent reality, but it doesn't go beyond that fundamentally. At large, in this sense, also the infantry does not seem to have been particularly cohesive. We can imagine lots of Phrygian infantry that would have fought together with the Celtic element, mostly as local levies serving the same Galatians as subjects, and not much more than that. So the Romans actually steamrolled them, and after that, doesn't seem like these Galatians are capable of doing much more, right? So this is, in a nutshell, what happens to many other tribes. Actually, other tribes were even more resilient, but in part also because they were more fringe. We've seen it with the Scordisci that were particularly, as we've seen, were part of the same group from which the Galatians, as we understand them in Asia Minor, had stemmed from. That, however, were also, again, a much more fringe reality, and as a consequence, not even such a relevant one in the bigger picture. Naturally, if we take into consideration the type of troops that these guys would have fielded, at large, would have been an elite. So those would have been good, etc. But the overall cohesion of Celtic hosts was not the one of a professional military, and they went on diluting their own warlikeness and effectiveness over time. Then, perhaps we'll talk about this on another occasion, but they would have essentially served the Romans at a point. They would have fought as Romans themselves. There were some Roman legions that would be later levied from this area, so of course coming mostly from Italic colonists settled as legionary, so military presence, that however did intermarry with the local women, so this mix of Galatian and Phrygian population that in part lived in the Roman legions as well. This is very important because, of course, there is always a continuity, there is always a story going on, one of resilience, one of resistance as well, which partly would have been opposed. But again, we're not looking at particularly cohesive groups that would be even a danger to begin with for much powerful neighbors at large, talking especially about the Hellenistic. Well, of course, they did create problems in the form of raids or stuff. Like, it's not that they had abandoned their own distinctive military style, but at large, they were not as dangerous as other peoples, and fundamentally, their military limits are reflected in that regard. We could talk more about any other kind of evidence. We will surely read some primary sources when looking at especially single battles, those anecdotes that were told about these fierce Celts that were, again, pretty tough and intimidating. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.